How the world works. The complete series framework. From the universe to the street corner. Introduction. It's the framework. This document represents the complete Limerick oral framework to understand how power, law, money, and control flow through every layer of human civilization. From cosmic to the individual, every layer we explore connects to every layer through one unbroken chain of transnational conflict that has been operating since America existed. The goal is not to inspire fear, hopelessness. The goal is to clarify, because once you understand the system from the top to the bottom, you can see exactly where you stand in it, and more importantly, what framework exists outside of it. This was never about drugs. It was never about crime. It was never about left or right. It's always been about control and knowing that's the beginning of power. Layer 1. For Chapter 1, the layers of reality. Layer 1, the universe, which is science. We start at the very beginning. The universe is infinite, vast, observation laws that existed long before any human has been drawn on a border or wrote a statute. Gravity, energy, matter, time, these are all rules that govern everything. No court, no government, no king has ever changed them, and none of them ever will. This is the foundation. Everything else sits on top of it. Layer 2 is our solar system. Zooming in, our solar system, the sun, the planets, the orbital mechanics that determine our seasons, tide, and calendars. These cycles affected ancient civilizations, religious calendars, and architectural societies, or agricultural societies. Understanding that we live within these systems, not above them, is crucial to understand everything that follows. Nothing we do about this layer. It simply is, but it shapes everything below it. Why these layers matter. Most people skip straight to politics and law when trying to understand the world, but transnational capital has always known something most people don't. The further up the chain you really operate, the more power you hold. The universe doesn't negotiate, neither does the system we're about to describe. Chapter 2, the Silk Road, where it all began. Before America existed, before Europe dominated, before the Catholic Church held full power, there was the Silk Road, the world's first transnational system of trade, knowledge, and control. What it was, the Silk Road stretched over 4,000 miles from north central China through Afghanistan to the Levant and to Europe, connecting Rome and China and every civilization in between. But it was far more than just a trade route. The Moors controlled knowledge. At its peak, the Moors and Islamic civilizations were the gatekeepers of all human knowledge. It was through Arab and Moorish scholars that Europeans gained access to Indian and Chinese advances in medicine, chemistry, and mathematics, and even Greek and Roman knowledge that had been preserved in Arabic translations. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Samarkand were not economic centers. They were intellectual and cultural capitals of the world. The Moors controlled the flow of knowledge the same way transnational capital controls the flow of money today. The flow of Moors knowledge eventually fueled the European Renaissance. The West didn't discover this knowledge, they received it, and they tried to erase where it came from. The first knowledge theft. The Crusades, 1096 to the mid-1200s, were officially about religion, but the Crusaders brought back wasn't just spoils, it was knowledge, more science, mathematics, architecture, and the banking concepts we absorbed into European culture. The Knights Templar, the military order created to protect Crusaders, became the first international banking system using knowledge they encountered in the Islamic world. Knights Templar connections. The Knight Templar invented concepts we still use today: letters of credit, international money transfer, and what we now call banking. They became so wealthy and powerful that in 1307 the Pope and King Philip IV of France had then destroyed their leadership, then arrested, tortured, and executed. But their knowledge didn't die. It went underground and eventually resurfaced in what became Freemasonry. Silk Road established the first template for transnational capital: control the routes, control the knowledge, control the world. Every system that followed used the same blueprint. Chapter 3, the East India Company, Transnational Capital, version 1. The East India Company is a missing piece most people never learn about in school. It is the direct ancestor of every modern multinational corporation and a template for how governments and corporations merged into a single powerful structure. The world's first multinational corporation, the English East India Company, was incorporated by a royal charter on December 31st, 1600, under Queen Elizabeth I. The Dutch East India Company followed in 1602, and at its peak the Dutch version was valued at over 8.2 trillion in today's value, a feat never matched in corporate history. Powers that no corporation should have. What made the East India Company unlike anything before or since was that it was authorized to wage war, sign treaties as a sovereign power, govern overseas territories, maintain a private army and navy, mint its own currency, tax entire populations. At its peak, the East India Company commanded a private army of 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the standing British Army. The Opium Connection. The East India Company ran opium from India into China, deliberately creating mass addiction to drain Chinese wealth and force open Chinese markets, as well caused the Opium Wars of the 1800s. The Chinese triads were really born as a resistance fighter against this opium invasion, then eventually joined the trade themselves. Too big to fail, the first corporate bailout. When the East India Company overextended itself, the British government bailed it out in exchange for regulatory control. In 1858, the British Crown assumed direct control of the British India Company from the company, which was ultimately dissolved in 1873. But the model survived. The Joint Stock Corporation, private armies enforcing commercial interests, government serving corporate power, all this became standard practice. The East India Company pioneered in the transnational system of business administration and governance that defined the modern world. America's own incorporation in 1871 used this exact model. China's Belt and Road is the same playbook. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has funneled over $679 billion into 165 companies since 2013, is the modern Silk Road, running the same East India Company strategy. Control the ports, control the infrastructure, control the trade routes, control the nations. The U.S. response, including American Infrastructure Compact of $500 to $1,000 billion, is simply competing international capital using the same blueprint. Knowledge Force, Secret Society, the Knowledge Keepers, Freemasonry, and suppressed knowledge. When the Knights Templars were destroyed in 1307, the banking knowledge and understanding went underground. Over the following centuries, it reserved in what became Freemasonry. A fraternal order with structure mirrors the same hierarchical knowledge system the template used. The Masonic hierarchy. Freemasonry operates in degrees of initiation. The higher you go up, the more you're trusted with. Most members never progress beyond the basic degrees. This layered access to knowledge mirrors the transnational capital system itself. Most people only see the layer they're in. Basic Masonry is 3 degrees. The Scottish Rite is up to 33 degrees. The Shriners are an ancient Arabic order of the nobles of the mystic shrine. Every Shriner is a Mason. Every Shriner is a Moor. Shriner's full name, the ancient order of the nobles of the mystic shrine, tells the whole story. They wear the fez, a North American automatic Islamic symbol. Their iconography includes Islamic crescents and signars. Their rituals reference Mecca. They're not coincidences. The knowledge from Freemasonry came from the Moors and the intellect tradition via the Crusades and Knight Templar. The Shriners preserve the most visible surface of the connection. Every Shriner is a Mason, but not every Mason is a Shriner. Every Shriner is a Moor, but not every Moor knows it. The Anti-Masonic Party, a warning nobody heeded. In the 1820s, the Anti-Masonic Party was formed in opposition to Freemasons, argued that a secret organization that much influence over banks, judges, politicians was a threat to democracy. This was Freemasons, America's first third party, and the first to hold a national political convention. They were right about the influence, but they got absorbed into the Whig Party, neutralized, and eventually forgotten. Who formed the Democrats and Republicans? Most people think a two-party system has always existed, but it as it does today. In reality, both parties emerged from a single battle that has defined American politics since the very beginning, the battle between state sovereignty and central banking.
No, you don't need those.
The original battle, Jefferson versus Hamilton. When the first Congress met in 1789, there were no formal political parties. The conflict ran immediately between two versions of America. Alexander Hamilton, Federalist, strong central government, a national bank, federal control over state debts, tariffs to protect industry, essentially the British model transplanted to America. Thomas Jefferson, Republic, weak federal government, state sovereignty, individual right, agrarian economy, no central bank. Jefferson and James Madison founded the Democrat and Republican Party in 1790, specifically to fight Hamilton's push for the central bank. This was the beginning of everything. The split in the Democrats. After 1824 election, the Republican Party split. Andrew Jackson's faction became the Democratic Party, and Jackson was the last person to directly fight transnational capital. He killed the second bank of the United States in 1836, calling it a monster that served wealthy elites over ordinary Americans. It took transnational capital in 1913 to get central banking back. The Republicans and the Masonic connection. The Republican Party was founded in 1854 from the remnants of the Whig Party, which itself was a merger from the National Republican Party and the Anti-Masonic Party. It is crucial the party formed into opposite Masonic influence that got absorbed into the Whigs, who then created the Republicans. The warning about secret society influence over American politics was eventually neutralized within the party itself. Both parties started as opposites to central banking and secret society influence. Both parties are now fully captured by the same transnational capital that were created to fight. The Civil War and how states' rights got stripped. The Civil War taught us about a war about slavery. Really, it's a lot more complex. It was the pivot point between transnational capital gained its permanent foothold in America by destroying state sovereignty. What the South was actually fighting for, slavery was morally wrong. That is not a question. But the legal argument the South made was about state sovereignty, the right to states to nullify federal law, control their own taxation, and trade, and maintain the primary of state citizenship over the federal system. Abraham Lincoln himself said if he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would. The Southern states believed that they were continuing the tradition of the Articles of Confederation. The states were sovereign entities that voluntarily joined a union and could voluntarily leave it. The federal government said no. The critical window, 1865 to 1871. After the South lost, transnational capital moved quickly through a series of legal changes that fundamentally restructured America. 13th Amendment, 1865, abolished slavery, but included the exception clause. Except as a punishment for crime, this exception would later become the legal foundation for prison labor. The 14th Amendment, 1868. This is the most important because in 1868 you were a citizen of your state first and the United States second. The 14th Amendment flipped this, creating federal citizenship above state citizenship. States lost their primary sovereignty over their own people. The District of Columbia Organic Act of 1871. Washington, D.C. was restructured as a potential corporation. Many researchers argue it's effectively incorporated the United States itself as a corporate entity, no longer a pure constitutional republic in the original sense. 1913, the year transnational capital won. With state sovereignty weakened in 1913 was when the system fully locked in. The Federal Reserve Act and private central banking, exactly what Jefferson and Jackson had fought, was installed to control the money supply. This fulfilled Hamilton's original vision 122 years later. The 16th Amendment, federal income tax. Now the government could tax citizens directly, bypassing state governments entirely. 17th Amendment, senators were now elected by popular vote instead of appointed by state legislators. States lost their direct representation in federal government. The last initial check on government power over the states was removed. Before 1913, states controlled their senators. No federal income tax. No private central bank. After 1913, transnational capital controlled the money supply, taxed citizens directly, and states had no voice in the Senate. The birth certificate and the Social Security bond would now be fully implemented. Chapter 7, which is the birth certificate, Social Security number, and bond system. This is where the system reaches down to the individual level, where every person is born in America as a financial instrument within the transnational capital framework. What does the birth certificate actually does? On a factual level, the birth certificate is the official government record of a live birth. It registers within the state as a legal person, and it requires a Social Security number, passport, school enrollment, and most government services. But there's a second layer. That layer and sovereignty community points to. When a birth certificate is filed, the government creates a legal framework, a corporate entity based on your name, typically written in all caps. The entity is separate from you as a living person. The argument is that this entity is registered as a financial instrument. Your future labor and productivity are essentially securitized, used as collateral for government debt. H.J.R. 192, the 1933 connection. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt took America off the gold standard through House Joint Resolution 192, when the government could no longer back its currency with its gold needed for another form of collateral. The argument in sovereign circles is that human labor represented through the birth certificate bond became the new backing for the current system. The Randall Keene Beef case, the proof. In 2017, Randall Keith Bean of Knoxville, Tennessee, attempted to access what sovereignty researchers call the hidden treasury account connected to a Social Security number. The access report required 3 components: your Social Security number, the 4-digit code identifying which Federal Reserve Bank holds your account, the correct Federal Reserve routing number. Bean was already a millionaire with banking connections. This was not desperation. It was a deliberate test of the system. He withdrew $800,000, purchased a $7,000 camper, putting the rest in CDs, legal banking instruments. The government's initial response was reporting a panicked extrajudicial detention before a proper arrest, suggesting they needed time to figure out how to handle the case without exposing the system in open court. He and his associate Heather Ann Tookie Jafar were convicted of wire fraud and money laundering. The most specific legal detail: the government never argued in court that the accounts don't exist. They prosecuted the method of assets as fraud. If accounts didn't exist, there would have been nothing to prosecute. No $800,000 to seize. Okay, maritime law and transnational capital. This is the invisible government that sits above all national governments, the legal and financial framework that transnational capital uses to operate across borders without being subject to any one nation's laws. Maritime and admiralty law. Maritime law is one of the oldest bodies of law on earth, governing ships, trade, commerce, and international waters. What most people don't know is the maritime and administrative law form the backbone of the global commercial system. When you engage in commerce, sign contracts, or interact with corporations or in government agencies, you are largely operating under administrative and maritime-derived frameworks, common law and the maritime law. There are 2 fundamentally different legal philosophies operating simultaneously. Common law, the law of the land, rooted in principles that you have natural rights, simply being a living human being. No harm, no victim, no crime, no victim, no harm. This framework that protects individuals. A maritime is administrative law, the law of the sea, about rules, compliance, jurisdiction over persons and entities, and commercial transactions. This is the framework transnational capital operates within and uses to control individuals who don't know they have a choice. Most people go through their entire lives without ever questioning which legal framework applies to them at any given moment. That question is where real power begins. The more sovereignty claim. The Moorish Science Temple and related sovereignty movements argue that Moorish Americans are the aboriginal people of this land, predating European colonization, and therefore operate under a different jurisdiction entirely. Their claim is not anti-government, but pre-government, that their sovereignty exists under national and common law, not the maritime/restrained framework. The rise of the Moors incident on I-95 in Massachusetts in 2001, where a convoy traveling from Rhode Island to Maine for training was stopped by police in a standoff lasting nearly 9 hours, illustrates both the seriousness of the legal claim and the system's response to it. The Catholic Church, cartels, and the criminal hierarchy. The Church as a layer of transnational capital. The Catholic Church is the world's oldest and most enduring transnational institution. It predates most transnational governments and outlasted every empire has coexisted with. Understanding the Church's role requires separating the spiritual institution from the political and financial one. The Church operates across all national borders, maintains its own legal system, canon law, its own diplomacy. The Vatican is a sovereign state, its own banking, the Vatican Bank, and its own intelligence network built over 2 millennia as in the Jesuit order. The Knights Templar connection. The original Knights Templars were warrior monks, the Catholic military authorized by the Pope. They became the first transnational bankers protecting pilgrims and their assets across borders. They become too powerful. Pope Clement V had them destroyed in 1307. Their suppression had with the Catholic Church reassuring control over the instrument that had grown beyond the control. The same pattern we see in the East India Company in the state. They are the only people that have their own sovereign land, which resides in London, which has been officially recognized about 100 years ago, I think. Mexican cartels and the Church. The cartels in Mexico are generally Catholic. This is not superficial, it's structural. Cartels territories fund local churches and are protected by silence from the clergy. El Santa Rita, a folk Catholic saint, is widely venerated in cartel culture. The Knights Templar cartel literally transnamed itself as the Catholic Middle Order and distributed Bibles while claiming to protect communities. Churches built and funded by cartel money are common throughout cartel territories. This is not Catholic officially endorsing cartels. It's the Church as a structural layer that both protects as is protected by the power structures that happen to be cartel controlled. Chapter 10, which is the organized crime hierarchy, gangs, biker gangs, and mafias. The 5 and 6, the people's nations and folks' nations. The street gang alignment is a system in America is not random. It mirrors ancient organized structures all the way up the chain. The folk nations, the 6-point star, gangster disciples, black disciples, Latin disciples, and other folks and disciples. The people's nation, which is the vice lords, their strong Moorish and Islamic influence, Latin kings, their own constitution manifesto, Blackstones, Moes, Gaylords. The stars themselves have esoteric meanings. 6 stars, Star David connects to Masonic and Kabbalistic systems. 5 stars connects to 5 between Islamic frameworks. And so even the symbols carry the same ancient alignment system. Biker clubs the same alignment. The alignment system extends to outlaws motorcycles. The People's Nation, last by the Outlaws, MC, and affiliated clubs align with the 5, such as the Wills. Folk Nation, the Hells Angels and affiliates take opposite side, not for opposite reasons, but because they're enemies of outlaws on the 5, and the Hells Angels and allies have been at war since the 1960s. The Mafia being pulled in. Telling the Mafia to deceive and maintain neutrality and operate on a pure business logic, but within the prison system, mixing population and drug distribution, requiring alliances, even through Mafia clans being pulled towards choosing a side. The historic connection to the Catholic Church through Italian Catholic culture, through a shared interest maintaining social order within their territories, places them closer to the people's nations, aligned structurally. Same hierarchical blueprint runs Masonic lodges to street corners, same structure, state symbols, same alignment, same system, different levels of access to knowledge and power. Of Chapter 11, the global drug trade, an unbroken line from the East India Company. Global drug trade is not a criminal aberration. It's one of the oldest and most consistent revenue systems of transaction capital, running in an unbroken line from the British East India Company to the CIA to cartels to your neighborhood. The East India Company opium trade. The British East India Company deliberately ran opium from the Empire to China to the 1800s to create mass addiction and drain Chinese silver. When China tried to stop it, Brink went to war twice to protect the drug trade. This is documented history. The triads were formed as a resistance to this and eventually became participants in the same trade. The CIA in Afghanistan. When the CIA began supporting Mujahideen fighters against the Soviet Union and Afghan in the late 1970s, they used drug money to fund the operation. Between 1982 and 1989, the annual opium production in Afghanistan increased from 250 tons to 800 tons. By 1886, the State Department acknowledged Afghanistan was probably the world's largest opium producer. After 2001 invasion, Afghanistan went from producing almost no opium under the Taliban to supplying more than 90% of the world's illicit opium at peak production, converted onto industrial factories. Kitchens, chemicals, and shipping letters remind you that opium only grows in two places in the world, which is the border region of Afghanistan in the mountains, and then in Mexico, and down in the tropical area. Also with the ephedra plant, the same idea. The 2021 pivoted to fentanyl. When the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021, the Taliban immediately shut down opium production. The global supply chain that transnational capital depended on was disrupted overnight. Fentanyl was not an accident or a trend, it was a supply chain pivot. Chinese chemical companies produce fentanyl precursors to triads, and Chinese criminal connections facilitate the transfer of Sinaloa and CJ Young manufacturing distributed fentanyl into the U.S. Chinese underground banking networks launder cartel money back to China. The same system dynamic launders Chinese capital flight money through the entire triads full circle. The Chinese triad began resistance into the East India Company opium trade. Today, they were full-service participants in the fentanyl supply chain, smuggling precursor chemical, controlling meth trafficking in the Asia Pacific, and monitoring for the Mexican cartels. The 14K Triad leadership has documented connection to the Chinese Communist Party consultative system. The Yakuza also play a role, but they've been going quiet. Japanese Yakuza, which won over 800 million, filed at 1800 by 2004. In our consecutive plans, the Union pledged to police that they would end all infighting and not make any trouble. The apparent retreat is not the end of Yakuza. It's restructuring to invisible financial nexus to the source. Their point we're starting becoming more opaque. They're moving to up the chain, invisible tree operators towards financial crime where they are harder to detect. The drug trade has never been about addiction. It's always been about three things: revenue, black operations, population control, and money laundering. Infrastructure flow from the transaction capital. Russia is the wild card. Every other player in this frame, the U.S., China, the Catholic Church, the cartels operate within transnational capital, even when competing against other parts of it. Russia is different. Russia is the one major power that merged with its criminal network rather than seeing it as a separate tool. How it happened, the Soviet collapse. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the KGB did not simply dissolve. The KGB took the state access and became oligarchs. Organized crime and intelligence service merged into a single entity. The privatization of the Soviet state was not an economic transition. It was the largest theft in human history, organized by the same intelligence apparatus that run the USSR. Vladimir Putin rose through exactly this system. The KGB officer who had become head of the SSB, the KGB's successor than the president. The Russian state and the Russian organized crime are not separate illustrations. We are separate. They're the same institution. The FSB manager murder. Russian organized crime groups covertly taxed by the FSB transferred part of their earnings to accounts that fund Russian corporate operations. The money laundering network clean money for the state and Russian oligarchs to evade sanctions. When political targets need to be eliminated, organized crime groups are used, giving the state plausible viability. Russia's ultimate weapon, the nuclear. No other player in this framework has the card. Cartels do not have nuclear weapons. Triads don't have nuclear weapons. The only reason transaction capital has not resorted to Russia is because Russia has threatened the entire system without nuclear disruption. This is why Russia has been able to say no in ways other nations can't. The sanctions were after Ukraine invasion in 2002. The speed of severity of Western sanctions, freezing access, even oligarchs and rushes from SWIFT, was transnational capital sending a message, get back in line or we'll cut you off from the system entirely. Russia's ability to survive those sanctions, partly through alternative systems with China, shows the limits of transnational capital's control. Russia is the proof that the system is not all-powerful. A nation that refused full absorption is still standing. The nuclear card is the one transnational capital cannot price in. Chapter 3, Drug Laws and Racial Control. Every drug law in American history follows the same pattern. A group of people becomes economically threatened or politically inconvenient. A drug set gets associated with that group through media propaganda. Laws targeting the methods you use the group are passed, and mass criminalization removes that group from political and not power. The first drug law in American history was San Francisco in 1875, an ordinance against opium dens targeted specifically Chinese immigrant neighborhoods. The state move was banning the method of the use. Smoking opium was criminalized, while drinking opium used by white Americans and tinctures and medicines remained legal. Cruel irony, many Chinese immigrants were feeling the very addiction the East India Company enforced on their country. They arrived in America as victims of British drug trafficking and were criminalized for it. Black Americans and cocaine in 1914. In February of 1914, the New York Times Magazine ran a headline, Negro cocaine fiends are a new Southern menace, fabricating a story of cocaine-crazed killers immune to police bullets. The article directly influenced Congress, which passed the Harrison Act at the same year, effectively outlawing opiates and cocaine. The Mexicans was legally brilliant. The Harrison Act was structured not as a drug ban, but as a revenue measure under the Treasury Department. The same Treasury Department holds the bond system. Mexican Americans and marijuana in the 1910s and 1930s. Anti-cannabis laws introduced across the Midwest throughout the Southwest in the 1910s and 1920s specifically targeted Mexican American workers and migrants. Harry, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Kissinger, openly racial language in his campaign, linking marijuana to Mexican immigrants, jazz musicians, and the black community. Nixon's war on drugs administration. The most damning evidence comes from inside Nixon's White House itself. In an interview in 1994, Nixon's domestic policy chief, Jim Ackerman, admitted to the journalist Dan Blum the Nixon campaign in 1968 in the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-left war and the black people. They knew they couldn't make it legal to either against the war on black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin. They are criminalized both heavily. They could now disrupt those communities. John Ackerman, Nixon's Democratic policy chief. This is not a theory. This is a confession from inside the White House. Crack and powder cocaine 100 to 1. In 1986, the Anti-Abuse Drug Act created one of the most blatant examples of legalized racist discrimination in American history. The President 5 grams of crack when triggered the same amount. Mandatory minimum system of possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine. 101 sentencing ratio. Crack and powder cocaine are pharmacologically identical. The only difference was who used them. Publicly, crack was associated with black urban communities. Powder cocaine was white professionals. While federal data showed the majority of crack users were white, nearly 80% of those projects under hard federal criminal law for African Americans. This disparity came to priority in the mass incarceration. Clinton doubled down in 1994. President Bill Clinton signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, allocating $12 billion to the states to increase incarceration. Not a Republican or Democrat issue. Both parties used drug laws and racial control measures throughout the 20th century. The 13th Amendment exercises in the full circle. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except for punishment for crime. Every drug law we described that was designed to criminate set poverty. Those criminalized powers became prison labor under the eviction clause. The same transnational capital that ran the East India Company open trade funded the CIA's Afghan drug operation. Profits from the fentanyl supply chain offered profit from the prison labor system that the drug trial used. The system capitalized their systems in the drug chain created active. The drug laws criminalized addicts in the prison system, created for profits from inmate chain national capital benefits from all three. The chain. As we travel from the universe to the street corner, we trace one of the broken line of power, knowledge, and control that runs through every layer of civilization. Now, the question is, what do we do with this? What we think the system wants you to think. The system wants you to think in terms of left, right, Democrat, black, white, gang versus gang. As you are not fighting within the system's terms, you are serving the system regardless of which side you're on. Both political parties were captured, both sides of the gang alignment were served the same transnational capital at the top. Both the drug dealer and prisoner feed the same machine. What the system doesn't want you to know, that Randall Bean's case proved that treasury accounts exist, that the system prosecutes the method, not the parties. The rights of the Moors established to the public that there are legal frameworks predating U.S. jurisdiction, that the Erickson administration proved drug laws were about racial control, not public health, that every drug law that follows the same basic template, which means that every person in prison under those laws was a political prisoner, not a criminal. The state national guards that cannot be federalized represent the last institutional check on transnational capitalist domestic power. The three frameworks outside the system. Throughout the entire chain, from transnational capital down to the individual, there are three main frameworks that exist generally out system. National law, the law of the universe itself. No national government created, no government can abolish it. Common law, the national law of the land. No harm, no victim, no crime. Rights as a human living being exists independent of any framework or a maritime framework. More sovereignty, the assertion that aboriginal peoples of this land predate and therefore operate under a different jurisdiction rather than the 1871 U.S. Corporation and its administrative law system. The question for every person watching this is not which side of the 5 or 6 are you on. The question is whether you are operating under national law, a maritime law, because that determines everything about how the system sees you and the power that you actually have. This is Russia's lesson. Russia proves the system is not all powerful. A nation that said no to full absorption is still standing. The lesson is not to emulate Russia's methods, but to understand that the system has limits that it can control, that it cannot control what it cannot price, and human sovereignty, property understood, and a property claim. This is something transnational capital has never fully been able to price. The final word. Everything we covered from the Silk Road to the Vietnam Pipeline, the Knights Templar to the Folk Nation, from the East India Company to the Federal Reserve, from the First Pacific Bonds to the 101 crack sense in Disbury, is one system, one unbroken chain of the power of protecting themselves and keeping the people. The fighting up instead of looking at it. Knowing the system is the beginning of freedom from it. This is the Wormwood Oracle. Stay curious, stay informed.